onto this. Hello, everyone. Let's get the right word document in front of me. That's not it. Okay, here we go. Okay. Hello, and welcome to this very organized installment of the Lawn Chair Philosophy Foundation's Continental Chop Shop series. Today, we'll be exploring the notion of being in general. This being is to be spelled with a capital B. This capital being is ultimately that which is in general as such. And we'll be discussing this notion from numerous perspectives within the continental tradition. The topic of being in general, all that ultimately is as such, is one of the most crucial topics within the continental tradition. Most major figures treat that which ultimately is as the grounds for reality, that is, meaningful experiences and objective appearances in one unifying way or another, but the specific nature of being as such, how it constitutes experience, what constitutes the optimal perspective for accessing the ultimate foundations of being's own reality, and how we go about honestly, authentically articulating certain ineffable aspects of our direct encounters with being as such and our descriptions of it, all serve as significant points of divergence for these same figures. Today, we'll begin our exploration with a short introduction of Husserl's notion of being and how it operates within his phenomenological framework. Then we'll move on to Heidegger, whose notion of being is so extensive. We have both Angela Heredia of Central European University and Donovan Irven of Filo, Sofi, Arts and Analecta, Hermeneutica, tackling the matter. Angela will touch a bit on earlier Heidegger and his phenomenological approach to ontology. That is the study of the nature of being, and Donovan will touch a bit on Heidegger's later notions. He'll then move on to Sartre's take on being, as well as some Simone de Beauvoir's input, and Angela will pick back up again with Fanon's notion of being. Angela and Donovan, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, David, for joining us today. It's wonderful having you all here. Are there any more introductory remarks or questions or anything else before we begin today? No. Okay. Well, then let's go ahead and turn to Husserl. So Husserl's ultimate phenomenological project is to found authentic objective measure for the sciences. He is, in his time, concerned about the standards of measure within the natural sciences, particularly how they have taken over, in his time, the philosophical discussion. How philosophy ought to contort itself and its whole field of study of life itself and our meaning of being here and what makes a good life and constitutes it. We should contort our measure of those ultimate questions to fit these standards of the natural sciences, which are operating on a naturalistic interpretation of our natural attitude. So our natural attitude really is benign in comparison to the naturalistic bastardization, possibly, of the natural attitude. It's just our way of going about the world in a familiar, habitual way and encountering this world of objects through belief systems or maybe practical interests or possibly theoretical interests. Our natural attitude has a rational basis. Our motivations for knowing, for using, and for uniting ourselves in this world and amongst our community members is generated through this natural attitude in a rational way. that plays out and habituates itself. What happens in the natural sciences is a naturalistic take on our usual way of experiencing the world is taken as the fundamental, principled way that the world appears, and we leave out of the naturalistic attitude any attending to a greater realm of possibilities of how the world could appear. Logic traditionally can account for the realm of possibilities and how it is this world, as we naturally go about it, arises out of all that could be. And this world of all that could be uh, influences our theoretical and practical comportment towards this world, as well as our belief system. So, what happens whenever philosophy is taking on these grander questions of what are our motivations? How do we develop good technique for living a good life, or at least developing a good technique for any particular craft or field in which you are engaged? Whenever we need to address our critical eye towards these foundations, we're stopped at a certain level from seeing more of this realm of possibilities and how it connects to our usual way of doing things, which does not allow us to witness for ourselves how this world originally emerges out of all that could be. We can't map out systematically how our imaginings, how our memory, how our personal sense of self and our upbringing relate to our community standards and all of the standards of measure which we've taken on, chosen for ourselves, and habituated uh, into our lives and into our evaluations. We can't see how those originally emerge. They're just handed down and given as the standard, and that reeks of dogma. That reeks of dogma. So Husserl wants to get beneath this naturalistic attitude in order to see how it is the natural attitude itself emerges amidst a greater realm of how it is we could be relating to this world, whether it be in a philosophically reflective way relating to this world, maybe in a religious way relating to this world, maybe in a spontaneous, artful, playful way of relating to this world that isn't beholden to these naturalistic assumptions about the way that objects appear in a causal way, in a way which we can measure with rulers and microscopes and displacement or what have you. The world appears to us as more than just objects that pertain to gravity and nature's laws as we've conceptualized them. This world means something more to us, and this greater meaning, this greater sense that the world has, informs any scientific exercise that is really just a particular mode of givenness, a mode of addressing the world that's situated in a greater horizon of meaning that motivates our experiences of this world. So there are a couple of routes we need to go to discuss Husserl's sense of being. There are layers and domains. Luckily, he has them well systemized, so hopefully we'll be able to go through them pretty well. We'll see. So what Husserl wants to do in getting beyond the naturalistic attitude in order to see how it is, why it is we have habituated ourselves into viewing the world of objects as we do as something which we can pick up, something that we can control, something that we can master through science and precise measure. And in order to do that, we then must get beyond the natural attitude itself. So he has us perform his epoche, his reduction. We're going to suspend our belief in the naturalistic assumptions about the world, the causes in nature, the source of objective standards to begin with. We're going to suspend our belief in that scientific way and look at our sort of communal ways, common ways of addressing this world. We get into what he calls the spirit realm in Ideas 2, and we're able to see how it is human beings come together to create the foundations for shared meaning, common meaning, and we set up certain communities around words and assumptions, certain belief systems, certain motivations, and any, again, vernacular or nomenclature that is going to come out of this context. And once we see that there are many contexts which we can take on, many belief systems, many languages attached to those belief systems and contexts, we start to see this underlying principle that allows for all of those contexts to emerge out of our experiences with this more fundamental material world, a material world that's ripe with possible ways of interpreting it way more than is allowed this naturalistic scientific attitude. So once we find ourselves within the spirit realm, where we together as rational beings are generating little communities and little contexts of particular meaning, we start to see this underlying condition, this principle that's going to allow for those contexts to arise. So now we have to do a double reduction. We perform this epoche again, and we suspend our belief in any one of those particular contexts, all of those contexts, really. Whichever one you find yourself in, you suspend your belief in that. So we are going to suspend certain, or Husserl believes that we can suspend certain metaphysical assumptions about this world that are fundamental to these contexts that arise communally and which are communally instantiated. So, you know what, we're not going to worry about how this book exists. The fundamental principle allows for this book to emerge as an existing object, but this object could also exist for me in my imagination. It could exist for me in a dream. There are many different sides or faces of this one object, and it's given in many different ways. Let's, you know what, suspend our belief in the existence of this book in order to see how all of the other modes of givenness are related to existence itself. And maybe we can get a better understanding of why it is we humans have come together and established this understanding of existence, which then might inform the natural sciences and so on and so forth in a foundational layered way. So once we have performed this epoche again, presumably, according to Husserl, we have accessed the realm of the absolute ego. This absolute ego exists in its own realm of being, in and of itself. And what Husserl means by this is that the absolute ego, the underlying identity, the subject to whom the whole world is given personally, this absolute ego is not beholden to time itself. It itself is temporalizing. So this absolute ego is transcendental. And the modes through which this absolute ego experiences itself in the world as a monad, we'll say, as a whole rational unit, is through acts of consciousness. The most fundamental acts of conscious activity are going to be memory, expectation, calls memory, retention, and expectation, pro-tension. We also have immediate sense impression that's anchoring our perception in the now. And then we also have a fantasy faculty that's sort of operating on its own. It modifies that which is given through sense and memory and expectation, but it too has a temporalizing function here. So now we have to explore the relationship between this transcendental absolute ego and the way that it is, its nature of being, its essence, if you will, and the different modes through which this ego is given in experience, moment to moment to moment, within context, within context, within context. So the this world in each moment is given to consciousness, and in an intentional way. Our experiences are structured such that there is always an experiencing ego, an object which is experienced by that ego and for which that ego cares. If we're going to use Heideggerian terms, let me not say too much on that yet. And then this content is experienced through a certain mode of givenness. So again, I can experience this book through reading it. That's a mode of givenness. I can, and that mode is determined by a context of I'm reading this book for a purpose. I am receiving a certain message from this, which is informed by my historical, socioeconomic position. That's a sort of mode of givenness. I can also slap somebody upside the face with this book. And now this book has been given to me in a completely different mode of givenness. Same book, but different mode. However, both of those instances, whether I'm reading it through a certain context or slapping somebody in the face for some reason or another, I assure you if I'm doing that, it's for a very good reason. The physical mode of givenness, the material mode of givenness does not change. So there are certain domains and levels to this modality for Husserl that really traces itself back to the ultimate modality of possibility. And again, we want to analyze how the many layers of givenness of this one object from the privileged phenomenological perspective, which can account for this givenness from absolute being all the way up into these more rarefied and particular modes of givenness. So we see that this book has a material substratum, if you will, but we also want to see how this material appearance of this book connects again to the a possible imaginative givenness, a dreamlike givenness, whatever sort of modification fantasy can bring, or how this book is given in memory, what I expect from this book. I can explore all of these interconnections from the vantage point of this absolute ego as I can observe it temporalizing a given moment through which this content appears. Presumably, again, there's quite the dance that Husserl commits in order to come to that conclusion where we can witness the becoming of objects and the acts through which they become. But he says it's possible, and for a while I can follow him. So this transcendental ego is set apart from these objective objectifications, if you will. These modes of full givenness of the subject that receives simultaneously the object which it receives. Both of those are playing a role in anchoring the absolute ego in the now, or at least anchoring its activity in the now, because again, it's sitting outside of time. Its activity is instantiating time. And so what we have what develops out of this process of synthesizing in a spontaneous way the a priori structure of a possible realm of givenness that is provided by a temporalizing consciousness. And it's each of the powers afforded, the four temporalizing elements I mentioned there. So we have a synthesis with the content that we receive in each moment. So we have absolute being, we have a temporalizing process, and then we have the ideas about the world which are generated from this process. Certain essences will arise. This book presents itself in a pretty steady way each moment. Maybe my dream image of this book or fantasy image of this book is pretty wild, but for the most part, this exists and perdures in such a way that I have the time to analyze its different modes of givenness, and so that I can then say this book is given to me in a transcendent way, mediated through the ideas that I have generated through encountering this book again and again and again, the different sense adumbrations that evolve through time, and the ideas, the beliefs, whether they be purely theoretical or practically involved, or motivated, pragmatically involved and motivated, or potentially aesthetically involved and motivated. These certain ideas about the essence of a book, what it is that I'm seeing here, will inform how it is this book is given in a transcendent way. So we have now to study being in itself, not in terms of the transcendental ego, but how these ideas generated out of the ideal principle that is the transcendental ego, how they're formed out of that stuff, for a lack of a better word. It's composed of ideal stuff, which itself is not beholden to time as we usually experience, as he'll say, objective time. Inner phenomenological time consciousness is the process through which we, again, temporalize our experiences, and then together we in order to be efficient, create objective times of clocks and calendars and the like. But these ideas that are informing how it is this object appears to me, the aspects which make it an idea, the ideality of these essences of things, the nature of things, is atemporal, not beholden to the structures of objective time, of succession of moments, of moment to moment to moment to moment. They are marked with the shape of the absolute now, through which the absolute ego temporalizes all of experience. So these ideas, they too have a sense of being in and of themselves. We can tell they normally operate in the background of our perception, in what Husserl will call a-perception. And so I can be sitting here reading this book. I'm not focused on the fact that the essence, the nature of a book sits before me, but in the background of my head as I'm reading it, I know I'm dealing with a book, and that knowledge is resting partly on that essence. But whenever we reflect phenomenologically on how it is these ideas generate out of the absolute ego and its synthesis and temporalizing processes and interactions with the world of sense that we make within its ultimate horizon, we can compare almost objects that are given through sense perception and objects that are given ideally. Since material objects will have a bit of ideal markings in them because it is out of the temporalizing activity of the absolute ego that objects become and they take shape. But they can definitely be differentiated from ideas themselves, ideas, essences, pure objects. They are given in a different way. And so the more we reflect on the origin of these ideas versus the origin of material sense objects, or we can make sense of ideas and essences. So let me be careful with my language there. So we are able to observe, we should be able to observe from a first person perspective, each of us, how it is these ideas are relating to the material world so that we can be sure that units of scientific measure that are based on those ideas are authentically related to the material world with which they are intertwined in the throes of experience. Husserl, again, to draw it back, his main project is to loosen the grip that the naturalistic standards have on conversations within philosophy about these greater questions of what could be, and to rest our evaluations on these naturalistic standards leads to psychologism, where we'll confuse, where we'll limit our exploration of the origin of our scientific values to this material world, which we want to understand. So if our standards of measure are derived solely from this material world, then we can't properly evaluate how well we are applying those standards, because we can't get beneath them to see how it is those ideas can be separated from the material world in a scientific, precise way for ourselves, in such a way that we can corroborate, hopefully. Again, this epoche is something that individuals should take on for themselves. You go and explore your absolute ego. David, you go and explore your absolute ego. We'll all do that, and then we'll come back together and say, hey, this is what I found. And then from there, anchor our logic on these transcendental grounds that allow us to get outside of our head, so to speak, not only outside of our naturalistic assumptions within the sciences, not only within our cultural assumptions that are habituated in our communal activities. And we should be able to suspend and get beyond even the assumptions that date back beyond our own cultures. These assumptions about existence and metaphysics, which have persisted, for thousands of years. And hopefully Husserl attains his goal. I think he doesn't, and we'll hear plenty about how he doesn't. Get beyond the metaphysical assumptions of not only the history of philosophy, but the naturalistic assumptions that are dominating the conversation of his day, so that we can, again, found our scientific units of measure on something which can account for a greater realm of possibility, for a greater realm of meaning, to connect the hard sciences and the soft sciences, and what's going on in the sciences with what's going on in the arts and culture, and have a clearer view of how it is our perception itself is conditioned, because scientifically speaking, we need to be, our evidence should be self-evident. And the naturalistic sciences have cut out the original self that's involved in constituting evidence. And it's almost as if through these naturalistic standards, figures in his day felt, at least according to Husserl, that we've found the ultimate clear language that's going to allow us to universally explore the world around us and to scientifically unite all of consciousness in this, that, and the other. But Husserl wants to get back to a more fundamental rationality, which will be this intentional structure that is temporalized through the actions of the absolute ego, um, and get to the fundamental intentional principles, or the principle of all principles of how this world of objects is given to us subjects, and how we relate together and create meaning together. So there were quite a few layers of being there. Just to reiterate, we have the realm of the absolute ego, which is a transcendental being, has its own nature that is. And then we have the transcendent, which are mediated objects, which gain meaning for us, not only through our use and familiar goings about with them, but from our memory and from our expectations and from our sense impressions and any modifications of fantasy. We generate these ideas that mediate our experience. And so we want to look at the being, the small b being of the transcendent objects of our world, and the transcendent sense of self we have, and measure the dialogue between this absolute self and the transcendent self. And then there's the being in and of themselves of ideas and essences, which will lead us into the next conversation, because that is what gets Husserl into a little bit of trouble, is that, well, this absolute being that you're talking about having its own existence, or being in and of itself, is closely modeled to these ideals, these essences that have their existence in and of itself. Are you projecting that model onto being and missing some aspect of its becoming, of how it is, that it's beyond time and space and this, that, and the other? What Husserl is the status of the absolute ego if its appearance so closely resembles, or the structures of its appearance so closely resembles, these ideas and essences, which are supposed to be generated out of this ego. So we have some circularity here that may be beneficial or may be pernicious. I'm not so sure. We shall see in our discussions to come. But that about covers the many layers of being in Husserl, and hopefully his scientific context helps make clear, why he sets the domains as he does. But that's what I have for you now. Any question? Let me look on the Facebook. Nobody's looking there. Okay. Yes, David.
Sure, I'll venture a question. That was a really helpful, brilliant. Wow, tour, Kelly, animal. That was brilliant. And let
Okay.
me ask you. So this reflective method seems it should be expected, right? And is this the outcome? That works equally well examining questions about materiality as it would about ideality, right? Because all of these are subject to the reflection of the transcendental ego. So they all have some way to be examined phenomenologically. It's pretty much a similar quest in each case, right? So is there a special status that materiality has, or ideality? And I think Hegel would call it concept,
Yeah.
maybe, or notion.
Well, when we've done the two steps of the epoche. We've done our double reduction. We are within a purely phenomenological space. Now, this doesn't mean that it's like holy or clean. Like, we are in the throes of becoming. Perceptual acts are situated in the now, which is in a constant flux, because we have a pull of memory fighting with this pull of our expectations, and then phantasm is in there modifying this, that, and the other. We have sense perception. There's a lot of tension and a little bit of strife happening in the now, even though Husserl has a very rational pattern helping or illuminating his idea of the phenomenological sphere. There's little in the way of harmony happening like in the now. It's a very intense space, and all we can say at the deepest level of that which appears is that it's a pattern of appearance. We can suspend our belief within that sphere that this book is material, and we can just look at the message which the words convey to us and explore the book that way. And of course, ideality is going to have more of a foundational role to play if we are to, separate these worlds. So what's happening at this fundamental level is that we find ourselves in the realm of pure essences, or at least we are on the cusp of this realm of pure essences. It's unclear in his writing whether we can definitively say that here is the now at its most fundamental level. I have gone into my own head, so to speak. I've suspended all of the belief systems that we've developed communally, and we're not worried about existence or materiality. I'm just seeing my absolute consciousness temporalize my private experience for myself. It's hard to distinguish sometimes with Husserl whether that realm is separate from the realm of essences. In Ideas 1, you kind of get this sense that there is this eidetic sphere of study where you're just worried about mathematics or logic or these pure ideas that represent that which we experience through sense, we'll say, or the generation of meaning. So numbers in and of themselves don't have too much meaning, although there is some memory involved in coming to know them. Anyways, that's a ramble. That's an aside. Back to the point. So for now, I like to take a sort of middle position where this inner phenomenological time consciousness, where we are in the now, in our private experience, witnessing ourselves constitute the space to experience the world objectively at all. And essences are going to allow us to determine whether sort of that the proportion of influence that either the material realm, will say, or the ideal realm has in conditioning whatever it is that appears before us, this object that appears before us. We're not going to say it's a material object that exists. We're just going to say, hey, this object again and again and again appears as a material object. And our immediate sense perception, or Heil, if you will, is going to impress its physicalness upon us. But there's a certain idea of materiality that can be separated from the physical mode of givenness of materiality. So materiality can be given in two different modes. Physical sense, this Heil, this visceral, touching it, and then the idea of materiality. So this is crucial for science because we want to make sure that um, we have the right balance between our sense perception, our Heil, which can be convoluted as it's applied to our assignment of a material identity that we will study, and the idea of materiality that's being applied to whatever it is that we're seeing, which can also be convoluted because materiality is not just contingent upon your conception of it. Materiality is a intersubjectively constituted idea, transcendent idea. Some transcendent ideas come from the private sphere, others are intersubjectively constituted. So there's so much convolution happening in both of those spheres, and the way that they interact with each other also adds another layer of convolutedness. So being able to see objects as merely just patterns that appear and reappear and reappear should allow us to access a realm of essences within the now. That'll be my mediating take between the kind of unclear domains that Husserl set up here. We won't reduce the now to an essence. It has an essence, but we can also observe how that essence emerges. We can get to the level of the absolute ego, he's going to say, and that's what will allow us to separate an essence from a pattern. And it's out of the pattern of appearances that essences congeal and establish these, through free variation, manifolds of existence or of being, a horizon unto itself of possible modes of givenness and meaning in this, that, and the other. So back to ideality and materiality. From after we've performed the reduction, we should be able to separate the two. And we need to separate the two if we are going to analyze how it is, as a scientific community, we've come to define materiality as we have, and make sure that it's matching up with right here and right now what it is that we're sensing, because that has changed since Descartes' time. That has changed since Galileo's time and Newton's time. We need to re-examine these fundamental assumptions about the concept of materiality, especially when you look at the problems that physics was having at the time, or that they're still having now in this issue of uniting itself, and the problems of gravity and with the other forces. How are we going to unite the two? I personally believe, well, if we go back and look at our fundamental assumptions about these very basic causal frameworks that science has not really looked over, then maybe we can efficiently overcome these issues in physics and move ourselves along. So again, we should be able to tell the difference between ideality and materiality, but the phenomenological task of detangling those is immense. Husserl believes it's possible, and I think it is to a certain extent, but we're not going to get we're not going to be able to see with the same precision that the naturalistic sciences have set up as expectations for measure, the distinguishing factors between materiality and ideality. It's like we won't be able to get out a ruler and say, all right, at this point right here, we see the cleavage, but we will, with objective sense, be able to separate the two and at least begin a conversation that will allow us to, as a scientific community, reflect on the origin of our values and how it is we are applying those values in being. It's a crucial fulcrum, if you will, for that dance. Yeah. I started to ramble. I don't know if I answered you. Okay, good. I got a thumbs up. We're good. All right, let me check on the Facebook real quick. No, we're still good. All right. Any other questions, comments, whatever? Donovan.
Isn't one way you could say Husserl's point, like the reason you can't measure with the same precision this distinction, for instance, between ideality and materiality, simply because you can't take the measurement into that level of analysis, because you're talking about the very thing that makes that measure possible in the first place. Because the ability to measure with the precision already rests upon the distinction between materiality and ideality. So you can't measure the distinction with that because the measurement itself depends on the distinction. And so on and so forth, right? Am I misconstruing Husserl?
No, that's perfect and very well said. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for tying that together, because that was great. Yeah. Anybody else? Angela, you good? Okay. Well, Heidegger crew, you go ahead and take it. I'm going to turn on this. I'm in my music school. I'm supposed to wear a mask, but I'm sitting right next to the home medics thing. So I'm going to turn my sound off.
Okay, so I'm gonna talk about Heidegger, precisely in Being and Time, and why for Heidegger phenomenology joins both ontology and hermeneutics. This won't be that comprehensive about Being and Time, so please, Donovan, fill any gap that you think I'm missing. Anything you can contribute. Okay, so why is it that for Heidegger phenomenology joins both ontology and hermeneutics? It is because for Heidegger, phenomenology is an exploration of what it means for things to be, of how they show themselves and become meaningful to us. So he says in Being and Time that phenomenology aims to, and I open a quote, to let that which shows itself be seen from itself in the very way in which it shows itself from itself. This is the formal meaning of that branch of research which calls itself phenomenology. So for Heidegger, beings become meaningful things become meaningful not in an internal concept, but in our everyday, outwardly way of being. So in our practical and embodied engagement with everything that surrounds us. So for Heidegger, consciousness is located precisely there, not in an inward mode of being, but in this ecstatically engagement with everything that surrounds us. So in this way, Heidegger is already challenging the primacy of the consciousness of the rational subject for the exploration of meaning, as well as, of course, the subject-object division in order to explore the question of being. So for Heidegger, beings do not appear as such within a neutral space, but within a specific horizon of intelligibility in which their meaning emerges. That is what Heidegger refers to as our understanding of being. And this is precisely for him, why him ontology is bounded with phenomenology. If phenomenology interrogates the way in which things appear to us as such, and if these things appear to us as such within an understanding of being, that means that phenomenology is bounded to the question of what of being, what means to be. So this understanding of being is not a fully explicitable background in which things make sense as such. So such horizon of intelligibility is not a specific concept of being, but an embodied engagement with the world in which we articulate and engage with things as meaningful. This is shared, and we are situated within this specific way of articulating meaning. This is what he calls being in the world. So phenomenology allows this understanding of being to show itself precisely by the work of the phenomenologist that interprets this understanding of being and sort of aims to show which are the conditions of possibility for things to become meaningful, to be for us. So this is sort of the task of being on time. So try to understand which are the conditions of possibility of existence in order for things to become meaningful or to be. So in this sense, phenomenology is bounded to hermeneutics. And in its sense, it renounces any attempt to fully make explicit this understanding of being. So Heidegger is very clear in saying that from the beginning, this is a failed and circular process. And in this sense, why is the hermeneutic circle? It's always failed in a sense for Heidegger. And it's always also situated, because the phenomenologist is within that horizon of intelligibility, and in that sense, that does not allow any objective and fully comprehensive account of this understanding of being. So it is always a situated exercise, as I already said, that is done from within. So Heidegger says in Being and Time, ontology and phenomenology are not two philosophical disciplines among others. These terms characterize philosophy itself with regard to its subject and its way of treating that object. Philosophy is universal phenomenological ontology and takes its departure from the hermeneutic of Dasein, which, as an analytic of existence, has made fast the guiding line for all philosophical inquiry at the point where it arises and to which it returns. So now I want to enter a little bit to the question of Dasein and why phenomenology and the question of being is linked to that. So as the quote said, the starting point of phenomenology is the interpretation of Dasein's being. This is a term with which Heidegger addresses what it means for us to be. Depending on the interpretation, it could be said that I agree with this one, that with this Heidegger is trying to target what does it mean to be human in our everyday engagement with the world. However, he is very clear saying that he's not doing an anthropology, that he's just targeting the existence. So, so the being of the sign is such that rather than being any particular thing or having an essence, it exists. So the sign is thrown into the world, and in that thrownness into the world, the sign sort of unfolds its being, his being perhaps. So the sign is always ecstatically oriented in practical and embodied engagement with everything that we encounter. We are there outside, existing. So for Heidegger, there is not a settled way of being the sign, and as its being emerges through this constant self-interpretation of itself and the world in which it is embedded. a world which becomes familiar, and this familiarity orients our everyday mode of being. So the science being, the science existence is always unsettled. For the sign, its being, it's always at an issue, he says. The sign always makes sense of itself, and it always takes at issue its own being. So, having said this, what Heidegger finds in Being and Time, so sort of like the result we could say, is that the sign existence is its condition of existence is temporality. So temporality is the framework of that horizon of intelligibility in which things appear as such. Therefore, the title, Being and Time, reflects this connection that for Heidegger, temporality and the understanding of being have for the sign. Yeah, and I think that's all I have to say for today. I don't know what Donovan has to say.
We could stop and like talk or take questions about being and time, because basically what I'm going to do is talk about Heidegger's turn, so to speak, and address both the way Heidegger views the interpretation of being in time and like the stuff, the esoteric stuff that he gets into at the fourfold and things like that. So we can have a little like discussion about being in time before I get into all that mess. I don't know what to call it. I love it's a lovely mess. But yeah. I will say I do also agree. We'll get to this also when I talk a little bit about Sartre, that I think being in time and Dasein is about human existence. Like you'll get certain Heideggerians all up in arms that like, no, it's not human existence, and Sartre's an idiot, and the French are reading it wrong, and it's translation issues and this and that. I'm sorry, but I've read Being in Time many times, and it's clearly that Dasein seems to be about human existence in that book. And I don't really know how else to parse that text just with the words that it says in it. Regardless
yeah,
of
Fanon would say a particular human existence.
Yeah, right. Say, yeah.
Is that an unpopular view in some circle?
I think people who do Heidegger studies like very seriously and who are into Heidegger are very resistant to interpreting being in time as being only about, where the term Dasein particularly refers to human existence. That is a big and contentious sticking point for people who are like very serious as Heidegger scholars, like who are into studying Heidegger as like that's their jam.
Because it's a more clearly defined aspect of human experience.
No, because they think he means Dasein means something deeper than that, or something that isn't only human, or something. Yeah, that's my gather. And I'm guilty of being a sort of Heidegger scholar. My first publications are on Heidegger pretty, so I'm not absolved of this. But I personally, I just think it's human existence and being in time. That's how I interpret it, and I think that that's how the book makes the most sense to be interpreted as that. And I don't think Sartre is like making some big mistake when he writes in that vein. Like that seems right.
Do you think that the aspect of historicity would really drive home that human aspect of being enthronedness and sort of support what you're saying?
Yeah, but I mean, Heidegger thinks that history has that being itself has such a history that can be disclosed in a certain way. So when he gets into the history of being and the truth of being in later, I think what ends up happening is you have to take Heidegger's later position and read it back into Being in Time in order to try to derive somehow that Dasein is not human existence in Being in Time. I think that's what you have to like do basically in order to make any kind of case that being in time is not talking about human existence when it says Dasein.
Okay, so what would the opposition claim be that it's about? They would say you can't put into words, but he put into words. So what would you say they're claiming?
I think the claim is like it's about the existence, how existence unfolds, but it's clearly that in being on time is someone's existence, and this existence is the science, which for me is a way he uses to not talk about human by using this term, but I agree with Donovan that it's about human existence.
Even in the late, I mean, he struggles with this in the late stuff to try to pinpoint exactly what he is talking about that isn't tied to human existence. Because I also don't really hold particularly that Heidegger abandons phenomenology entirely. I think Heidegger remains a phenomenological thinker for the most part, and thus he's always stuck with having to account for the movement from my perspective to some sort of shared reality. And even when he's talking about the fourfold and the clearing and stuff, it's still clear that there is some perceiver, that being is being insofar as it appears, and it must then appear to something. Or else we're not talking about anything if it's not making an appearance. We're talking about some undifferentiated who knows what. I don't know.
So let me ask Angela then. I'm most familiar with the first half of being in time, so I'm a little bit, this question's a little, maybe it's obvious if you've really studied the whole book thoroughly. Where is he contrasting or bringing up the question of hermeneutics? I only briefly remember him talking about it, yeah, but you're saying it's, so like, help me defining, well, I know what it is in studying text, what a hermeneutic process is. So he's sort of saying you have to look at his book as doing that kind of process in answering the questions. Is that what you're saying, Angela?
So your question is how is hermeneutics playing a role there again?
Yeah, how's it playing out in that book and the claim, yeah, that you're saying, which is you start out that it's a joint of ontology and hermeneutics. He feels that's the way he's approaching ontology, is through a hermeneutic process, which necessarily has a circularity. Is that the main point, sort of?
So as I said, hermeneutics comes to play a role because for him, addressing the question of being is intrinsically a question of interpretation. Now, what is interpretation, right? How do you interpret being unfolding in meaning for him? I don't think he does a good job in being on time. And for me and the work that I have done on Heidegger, the important question there is targeting how he approaches language and what language is for him in human existence that could allow this sort of interpretation of this horizon of intelligibility. And what I saw in my bachelor's thesis was that sort of being on time fails to do this job because the way it approaches language does not, how do I say it, sort of betrays the importance of embodiment, for example, for language. So the way language is used in being on time is very like a formula of concepts that does not allow to address this embodied horizon of intelligibility. This, I think, changes with later Heidegger, and that's why poetry becomes so important for him. And he sort of, for me, later Heidegger is sort of trying to look for this language for phenomenology being able to address being, and sort of poetry and all these things he does later is trying to find that, which he was not a good poet. and sort of yeah, sorry. And that's why for me I try to sort of complement that aspect about language and the work of interpretation with what Merleau-Ponty says about language, and how language in its embodied nature sort of just tries to explicit something that we already know in an embodied way. So it's always sort of a failed task. But for me, Heidegger has very interesting things to say about language, even in Being and Time. I think you can already find this sort of poetic and embodied conception of language that you find later. You can find it already there, hidden in that jargon and all that. But for me, you can find it already there.
I think for Heidegger, understanding is like at base interpretative. And since the world is only given through its appearance as a kind of totality of references, as he calls it, what structures your experience as having a kind of unity to it, trying to get at ontology is always a hermeneutic process, because it involves like interpreting your way through that network of references to the question of being that it opens up the possibility of asking. So like when the hammer breaks, the famous hammer, it becomes possible to ask this question. Okay, here's the possibility. So now if you're going to actually seize on the question of the meaning of being when the hammer breaks, that becomes an interpretive question of how to navigate like the system of references that the hammer reveals in its brokenness or whatever.
So isn't he just showing that by giving those examples? So he, in a sort of poetic way, he's talking you through those meaningful examples. So he's getting his message across that indirect way by storytelling, right? So is that a sort of success? Because that's what he was sort of trying to say, is that you have to look at it this way. I can't put into words any better than just tell you about it and like get it. You know, do you get it?
For my own part, I think when Being in Time is working best, that is happening at its most like philosophically significant moments, whatever we take that to mean.
When you're not choking on it. Yeah, when you're
I think yes, okay. And then the question I guess becomes something like, how often and where in the text is that actually occurring? Which is, I think, an interesting question. It's a book that I find very rewarding, but you know, that's a result of my own personal history and study and stuff, you know. So
yeah, if it could have only been 5 pages long.
I agree also totally that, and one of the things I was going to say, the language of later Heidegger is exactly a search for this language. I mean, you'll notice already in Being in Time, he's abandoned Husserl's vocab. He doesn't really talk about consciousness. He doesn't really talk about intentionality. Even, you know, he has his moods and alignment and attunements and things like that. So he's already got the idea very early that he has to get out of the traditional vocabulary somehow, right? And so I think that's another hermeneutic aspect of his philosophy, is that he's very attentive to like how he's trying to talk about things, and the way that how you talk about it shapes the content of what you can talk about. There are things like that about Heidegger that one of the reasons I still find value in studying Heidegger, and I don't just throw him out the window, is because there's insights like that about his method and things that I think are right. I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, I see. Now, is your attempt to do that successful? But the fact that you really took that seriously as a problem and it shaped your whole thousands of pages that you wrote and all these lecture courses that you gave and everything is like really, I think, you know, significant. So he takes that language of, and he'll talk about the language of opening. So he uses a series of metaphors like glass blowing or making a jar. And the famous one is the clearing, the thrown open clearing by the fire, the lightning. So you can very easily imagine a fire in the center of a place that throws open this lightened area. And that's the world in which our being is. And it's into that clearing that all the particular beings that we encounter as things step forth. And they step forward into this clearing and are lightened up and make their appearance to us. And they withdraw again into the darkness of being when whatever it is happens again. And he tries to develop this whole sort of poetic language around the process of how this happens. Now, again, though, what is lightning? Well, that's like the light of consciousness. And even he doesn't want to use the language of consciousness and everything, but it's clearly that there's something in that is opening the world to make its appearance, so to speak. And that seemed to be our temporal existence, which Heidegger talks about as a series of ecstasies that temporalize the clearing as things enter into it and exit from it again. The trickiest thing that he introduces in trying to unpack this metaphor is what he calls the fourfold. And already I think you should see immediately that it's not an object. It's not like a folded up piece of origami. It is the folding into something that then generates out of that process of forward folding these four things that he talks about, right? So you can't lose sight that he's always talking about time and a temporalizing process, because he talks about as the fold occurs, you get the earth and the sky and mortal and divinity. And he talks about them as this process of folding because he doesn't think that you can neatly separate them, that they exist as a sort of unity that reflect one another. So the easier, probably earth and sky are the easier ones to talk about, because it's clear that the earth means basically all of the material stuff and life-giving sustenance that you encounter in the world. So the place I'm getting this mostly from on this is the Bremen and Freiberg lectures, where I think he's perhaps the most lucid on the subject. So he just says that the earth is the building bearer. So that kind of the foundation, it bears buildings. What nourishes, fructifies, so it brings forth life and that kind of thing. And tending waters and stones, plants and animals. So it's tending and nurturing. So the earth is allowing all of that natural order stuff to come into being, and it nurtures them. And so it's water and all that kind of that. You can see Heidegger said as perhaps most pastoral also in some of this stuff. But I do think he's trying to nod. So when I read that generously, I think he's trying to nod at kind of an underlying nature to things, that there is some kind of basic level at which we're pulling all the stuff that we build our technologies and we build all of our artifices and whatever, however complicated it gets, whether we go to the moon or whatever, there is some kind of nod to this basic underlying structure that we pull all the natural resources and raw materials from to build that kind of thing. That's I'm trying my most generous. And then the sky, the path of the sun, the course of the moon, the gleam of the stars, seasons of the year, light and twilight, and all that. So again, when you get the image of the ground, it automatically implies the image of whatever's above it. So you again, the fold creates this duality that reflect one another. He calls it a fourfold mirroring. So as soon as you postulate something like the earth as a kind of a ground, you immediately get the thing that is over top of it, and is by which you sort of count or are able to tell that time is involved in the ground. It's the seasons and the passing of time and the change that's marked on the earth as it goes. Now again, though, you have to have something to which these things can sort of appear in this way. without something to tell the day from the night and the passing of the stars and all that and kind of stuff, that doesn't really mean much of anything. So you get mortals and divinity on the other side of the fourfold. And again, it's a kind of mirroring. So where the mortals are finite and positioned within this in relation to the earth and the sky, and bring forth determinate beings into their little clearing, divinity is the sort of infinite side of that. And it is also the thing that gives humans the sense of meaning coming from elsewhere. Like when humans talk about things, we always get the sense that the meaning is not really coming from us, that it has this like extra subjective source somehow. And the God is also Heidegger's way, I think, of talking about this sort of phenomenological feeling of the transcendence of meaning for us. That it's, and he also plays a lot on the German for there is, which is it gives, right? Es gibt. So the sense and feeling of of givenness that comes with the world comes from this mirror image of the mortal in the God. And so on and so forth. The gods also give this sense of sort of like synthetic unity to things, I think. Remember in this famous last interview, Heidegger mentions that only a God can save us. And so I think Heidegger is looking for, I interpret Heidegger to be an atheist. I don't think he is, I think he's trying to transcend Christian theology. And so we're getting a kind of post-theological God. I think the God or a God for Heidegger is some kind of post-theological concept that's grasping for the eminent feeling of transcendence, specifically in relation to like why the world means something beyond just my particular denotation. Some sort of bare like denotative nominalism or something like that. I do think it is a kind of mysticism. I think Heidegger is like leaning into a mystical tradition, and Meister Eckhart and those kinds of things are very clear. I definitely think that if you really, really, really push late Heidegger, he's going to say like, yes, of course, we lack the language to really talk about it. We have to shelter being in these inadequate homes, language being the house of being and all of that. And so, yes, the language will ultimately fail and be inadequate. And so, yeah, I'm trying to talk about it in these roundabout ways, and we're going to make different passes at it and try. And it's, I think he's influenced by Eastern thought in this. He had several students from Japan. He was attempting to translate the Tao Te Ching into German with a student, a project which ultimately failed. He was familiar with Taoist thought. I think that's making an appearance here and is an impact. And Heidegger was very influential in Japanese philosophy, the Kyoto school that was founded in the 1930s and 40s. And that, it's a lot of dialogue, intercultural philosophical dialogue between that. Heidegger does not credit, nor does he talk about Taoism in any kind of favorable way. I think he totally appropriated whatever ideas he found. But I do think it's clear that I think there's clear influence of that philosophy. The Japanese Zen interpretation of Taoism specifically, I think, is clearly impactful on Heidegger's poetic turn. The last thing I'll say about this is the one of the ways that helps me understand what Heidegger is attempting to do is still just to get that he is in this Kantian tradition. So the reason why Heidegger pushes so hard back against Dasein being merely human existence and all that kind of stuff, and why he has this turn is I do think that he's trying to talk about something like the conditions of the possibility of something. And so when he says things like, well, I'm trying to get deeper than just human existence and so on, he wants to show why human existence is possible in the way that it is, which is why the fourfold still includes in it mortals, which is a clearly human category that gets revealed through the folding of these things together, and in relation to which human existence has to stand against some reality that's kind of you can't say at that point, though, that reality is independent of human existence. That still doesn't fly, I don't think, for Heidegger at this. Insofar as there is a reality, human existence is a part of it. It's the part from which we'll access anything like reality, and we're always going to be reflected in that process. Like, I mean, I think that's probably Heidegger's ultimate position. I had a very interesting conversation with John Salas about the transcendental nature of Heidegger's project, and he agrees ultimately that Heidegger is attempting some sort of transcendental project to show what we could talk about in terms of the conditions of the possibility of human existence, particularly meaning and significance as part of that, and so on and so forth. So that has been helpful for me to understand Heidegger's project by and large, even though I know there are Heideggerians out there that would like come after me. I don't think I'm saying anything that really misrepresents Heidegger or falsifies his thinking or anything like that. I'm simply attempting to give people some inroads into a thinker that can be opaque and difficult. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
If anyone comes after you, they're coming through me.
I can see people like cringing sometimes when I say these things. But I've been in there. I've been in the seminars, and I've talked to the people, and I've done the work, and I feel confident in what I'm saying.
You're allowed to say it. Do you think that the imagery aspect of poetry, not just so much that the language itself lends itself to irony and multiple meanings, but the imagery that it conjures helps us conceptualize that this ultimate being, maybe in such a way that we can't articulate it precisely? I don't know, this fourfold seems so full of imagery and analogy, and it makes me. I heard once that Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche is not okay, but I see something of Nietzsche's push that, you know, imagery and mythology, that's going to do much more for uniting us culturally and establishing our understanding than logical principles are going to. And I just see so much of Nietzsche's poetics and harping on imagery going on here. And I also just want to be not to put a purpose on this, but I do think there's something to Heidegger's Nietzsche studies. I don't know. I have not done as much Heidegger work to say.
If you want to discover what Nietzsche really thought, and if you're on some quest to understand Nietzsche on Nietzsche's own terms, then no, do not read Heidegger's Nietzsche. But I'm going to be completely honest, Heidegger's Nietzsche books are some of the most like stimulating and rewarding philosophy I've ever read in my whole reading career. I love those books. I think they're so good. But it's Heidegger doing his project and his interpretation of the history. And there are some real startling and cool insights into Nietzsche in them, but it's not a work for people who think, I'm going to read this to better understand Nietzsche. No, don't do that.
Sort of funny, Don, I think what you're saying is sort of he's doing a Nietzsche on Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Paying him back, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there is something there though about the notion of interpretation. Because of course for Nietzsche it's about display of instincts. And I think Heidegger takes a little bit on that. And I think already in Being and Time, you can see a little bit of what you were saying, Kelly. And it's that for me, he's already thinking that language and meaning are not enclosed by the word. So language and meaning are more embodied in a way for Heidegger that he cannot explore in Being and Time because of the language. So I think he takes a lot from that in thinking that meaning is not captured by the word, but just by the word and the sort of the referential character of the word but this sort of play of meaning that poetry allows you to do.
Also, I think you can see in Heidegger's Nietzsche books an important pre-theoretical or a precursor. I don't know what you would say. You can see deconstruction forming, because Heidegger recognizes that when you talk about Nietzsche as an inversion of Platonism or something like that, when you invert the terms that structure a metaphysical system or something like that, it can't be a mere flip. You can't just turn dark to light. The whole system is transformed through that inversion. And so that trick of flipping the terms creates a systemic transformation that reverberates throughout the whole system of references that were structured around that paired term. And this is like, Derrida is like all saying that in the End of Subjectivity, and in the interview, the postscript, I forget what it's called now, where he's talking about Hegel. You can see very clearly Derrida says almost an exact version of the same idea, that it's simply insufficient to reverse the terms of an ordered pair without recognizing the systemic transformation that is generated from such a logical maneuver. So that is a big part of point of interest that Heidegger sees in Nietzsche already. So if you're interested in the history of deconstruction, the Nietzsche books by Heidegger are good history of idea type source, genealogy, one might say, of the deconstructive method.
Cool. Thank you.
Start talking about Derrida, I'll get people real worked up.
Stay away from the origin of geometry, and I'm okay.
Right?
I'm okay after that.
You mean it doesn't apply already another essence or another structure at the site of origin, which is the structuring structure?
No. Learn jazz. Anyways. Continue.
No, that's all I got. I'm not going down that road.
Well, if there are no more Heidegger questions or comments, there's nothing on the Facebook. I'd like to go ahead and move right along to some Sartre and du Beauvoir. Take it away.
I'm going to be fairly brief and focus on mostly the opening sections of Being and Nothingness. I mean, you could say something like, well, all of Being Nothingness is really Sartre's answer to this question, right? But strangely, I think Sartre is just very clear about what he thinks being is right at the very start of Being and Nothingness. And then the rest of the book is just like sort of hashing out all the details of the modalities of the for itself and that kind of thing. But in terms of like what he thinks being is, it's right there, very, very clear. So I might also say a little bit about his, just to tie it into the other talks a little bit. Sartre does reject the Husserlian notion of the ego when you get down into like the realm of the absolute ego, for some of the same reasons that Heidegger also rejects that, but also it's also tied to like how Sartre understands freedom and his notion of a radical freedom. And I would say the idea of the situation takes over the importance of the absolute ego in Sartre's phenomenology, because the situation gives the structure in which meaning is going to be established and in which freedom will be enacted and all of that, kind of stuff. That might have been a really bold claim, actually, I just made. So I don't know if I can back that up, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So at the very, very beginning, like first couple lines of Being and Nothingness, Sartre basically says that the reduction of being to appearance has been a huge like progress for philosophy, and he's on board with this. So there, I think you can see the influence of Nietzsche. I think Sartre's bringing a Nietzschean criticism into phenomenology to basically embrace this idea that being and appearance are bound up. So Sartre sees this as related to dualism, that one of the reasons why it seems appealing to reduce being to appearance is because it cuts through all kinds of dualisms. It gets rid of mind-body dualism, and it does all of these like fancy things. That's why people have liked that sort of maneuver in the history of philosophy. But it doesn't really get rid of dualism. Sartre thinks that you end up basically just revealing that there's one key dualism that is underscoring all of the other dualisms that philosophy gets concerned with. And that is the difference between the finite and the infinite. Okay, so let's say a little bit about how he gets there. I just want to note that this becomes a big conceptual point of contention in French thought. You'll note that Levinas has a very important 61, I think it's 1961 book, Totality and Infinity. Levinas is of Sartre's generation. He wrote a book or a thesis called On Escape that treats the concept of nausea at the same time that Sartre was writing about nausea and these kinds of things. So Levinas and Sartre have an interesting intellectual relationship. And I think the proclamation by Sartre that the infinite and the finite are the fundamental dualism at the heart of these like others is impactful, right, for other people thinking about the subject. Okay, so why is it the infinite and the finite? Well, if you reduce being to appearance, it's not just one appearance. What you're actually reducing being to, in Sartre's words, is the order of appearances that manifest it. So now you're getting into, there's now a sequence of manifestations that constitute being. And we're not talking about reducing it to any one of those. Obviously, the world's not like that. You can't do it. If you did that, there would be no motion, there would be no time, there would be no like change of anything. There would just be one static state that never did anything. And that would be the end of our story. We wouldn't even be able to talk about it or write a book or do anything. There would be no, I mean, it would just be incomprehensible, literally, you know. So there's this series that now, when we start to attend to the series that manifests in appearance, we quickly get to the idea that it could appear infinitely, even just to one given subject. Husserl talks about this in terms of adumbrations. Animal talked about these adumbrations, and Sartre takes that idea up directly from Husserl and uses the same language. In fact, he uses the German in the French version of Being and Nothingness. The term for adumbration remains in German. Since we're only ever given being under a particular aspect, we only see one side of it. We only see it under this particular lighting, or so on and so forth. Even as we begin to move around an object, we start to see it under a variety of manifestations. We see first one side, then the other side, then this side, then the back, and so on and so forth. And it quickly becomes apparent that as we look around, we're seeing all kinds of different adumbrations, and these could be multiplied to infinity. And then we begin to think about other people and the adumbrations that must be appearing to them, and so on and so forth. And so now we've thrown ourselves into this distinction between the finite appearance of the world to me and the infinite possibility of its manifestations through all of these like possible adumbrations, right? Now we could think something like, well, maybe there is something like the theoretical totality of all these manifestations, something like the world as all there is, to like Wittgenstein's, you know, the world as all there is the case, theoretical postulation of every possible adumbration, whatever. Well, that's a nice thought, and it could be an interesting guiding principle, but Sartre thinks something like that's really merely theoretical. Perhaps it's a necessary or inevitable theoretical postulate, but we'll never be in the position of grasping an infinite totality of adumbrations or anything like that. And again, such a being starts to look even, I mean, it starts to look unattainable because it would have to stand outside of time. So it would lack the mechanism that would like give the appearance to it in its temporality and so on and so forth, because it would have to be able to have that God's eye view of everything sort of all at once, so to speak. So I think Sartre rejects this as a possibility. I think he seems to think you can postulate it as like a theoretical consideration, as like a nice like thought experiment, but it's never, you're never going to attain it, of course, yourself. And it's probably not attainable by anything that looks anything like us or has the kind of experiences we have at all. And so it's just really like, meh, okay, cool, but we're not going to get very far in thinking about that. We need to bring it back down to like this kind of experience that we're actually having, that's going to reveal things to us that we actually can grasp and get at, and so on and so forth. Now, what it begins to look like for Sartre, and I hear again his Hegelianism, I think, that being as such then is unstable, that there's something happening that's going to set being into motion, and that's going to be the eruption of nothingness into being, and that's going to generate these two modalities of being, which is the in itself and the for itself. If it wasn't for the for itself coming into existence, if that nothingness hadn't erupted into being that resulted in consciousness, that resulted in the being of something that could become aware of itself, being, all talk of being in itself would be superfluous or redundant, Sartre says. He wants to kind of catch philosophers in this, in what he thinks is a kind of theoretical elision or omission. That philosophers always want to talk about reality or being in itself. And that's supposed to tell us something. It's supposed to tell us an object that we can get at, what being is like in itself. And Sartre wants to say, the minute you say something like that, you admit already that there is this other kind of being. Because being in itself, if there's no other kind of being, is redundant or superfluous. He says this a couple of times in the opening parts. There must be something else besides being in itself, and that's the being for itself. That's the being for itself. So if you really want to account for being, you have to be able to account for being in both of these modalities, both in as it is in itself, so to speak, and in this mode of for itself. And for itself is where you get freedom and human, and that basically, for all intents and purposes, the for itself could be human being or human subjectivity for Sartre. I think that you could argue that anything that lives for itself and is capable of having a consciousness would be for itself. But it's clear that Sartre isn't much interested in talking about that, that he's fine to be anthropocentric, and that he's talking about human existence. And maybe there are aliens or something, or animals, an octopus or something that has a consciousness and lives for itself, and that's all well and good, but we don't know that, and we're not octopuses, and that's not what he's talking about. So again, we could criticize Sartre on a couple of grounds for those positions, but I think those are those positions that he holds in regard to that question. Sartre commits himself to a line of philosophical questioning that has a starting point in subjective self-reflection. I mean, it goes back to Descartes, and it's in Husserl and in the Cartesian meditations and in all of this kind of stuff. I think it's still there in Heidegger, which is why I say what I say about being in time and Dasein and being in time. And Sartre is very upfront about it. He doesn't want to hide it, or, he thinks that this is the method I've chosen, this is the theoretical starting point, and this is where I have to deal with these issues along the way, because that's just the consequences of the method. He has a very long refutation of metaphysical solipsism that begins section 3 of Being in Nothingness, exactly for this reason, because if you start with this sort of enclosed subjectivity and are tasked with moving from that to the shared objective world, you have to be able to show how you're not locked in there indefinitely, and you have to show that there's an exit. You know, ironically, he's aware. I mean, he knows this is why he calls it No Exit, the play. I mean, right? There may be an exit from our self-enclosed subjectivity, but no exit from the shared world of others' subjectivity that, you know, impinges upon us or that we feel. I'll elaborate on anything that I said. For Sartre, being, I think, is reducible to appearance in a lot of ways. He doesn't take that to be an insubstantial claim. He thinks that that's, you know, something profound to recognize. And because being is appearance in this way, it's always going to bifurcate in that Hegelian kind of dialectic movement. You have a being that is just what it is, that is being in itself. And then you have the production of this being for itself, which is human subjectivity. It's future oriented. It has an image of itself. It's aware of how it feels about things and of its possibilities. And the for itself is the seat of potential. Also for Sartre, there would be no potential in the world if there wasn't the for itself. Once nothingness gets going, through the act of negation that founds consciousness and allows it to the world to appear to it and it to appear to itself as an object of experience, that's what generates potential. Because the for itself is the only thing that can see potential or possibility. Without the for itself, potential appears to nothing, and the world just is what it is, just doing, and there's no possible other way to be anything or whatever. It's just, you know, that's it.
Yeah, so I would ask, it sounds radically like the beginning of Hegel's logic. I mean, you know,
It
is there some divergence from it, or does he feel like that project wasn't clear, or was had too many layers of structure, that it didn't discuss freedom as a direct, immediate, low-level part of being, because that comes much, much later in Hegelian development. Like after there are intersocial structures and things.
No, freedom comes immediately with Sartre. Like the movement of the nothingness, the movement of negation is freedom appearing into the world because it's spontaneous and all of these things. Like, so where Hegel goes wrong for Sartre is trying to land into like an absolute subjectivity. For Sartre, Hegel is on the right path, but what he has to do is actually account for the dialectic within a completely immanent historical material plane. Because Sartre embraces dialectical materialism. He's a Marxist in that sense. So there is no absolute subjectivity which would take in all of history as its like point of view or anything like that. It all has to be an immanent human historical unfolding for Sartre. Yeah. But you're right, in terms of the logical structure of Sartre's argument at the beginning of Being and Nothingness, it is Hegel's logic. It is.
Because freedom at that level would be so bare. I mean, there's freedom at that level. It's freedom at every level. But, you know, the freedom I think you're talking about is human freedom, which I think for Sartre would be the most developed kind of political, where, you know, human individuality. That assumes so much structure, you know, in terms of being a logician. Maybe he's not approaching it that way. He's beginning with, well, we have meaning to start, and so I can start at this immediately, right?
So that's why I said what I said about the situation, I think comes in here, because Sartre says then, as he gets into discussing the for itself and its structures, he says this freedom is a merely theoretical freedom, and it has no value or meaning at that level, basically. All human freedom, which is the freedom that matters, is a situated freedom, which means it's been given a determinate content. And that's what individualizes it and gives humans the context in which we can make our decisions and pick our projects and do all of that, you know, kind of stuff. Yeah. And that's what the only freedom that matters. Other freedom is exactly that, just freedom in the abstract.
Yeah, so the big freedom is yet to come. Really.
But the reason why he's interested in the freedom at the level is because he wants to show that existentialism has an ethics, and it's an ethics grounded in freedom, but it's also an ethics that denies a transcendental absolute source of that ethical imperative. And so the reason it has to embed freedom at the level that it does is because it hopes to derive an ethics from that eminent freedom. And so the argument that they're going to make is a kind of a transcendental argument that abstract freedom is the ground of all of the other values and projects that humans take on. And that's why it has an ethical force, is because it is the condition of the possibility of any given human project whatsoever. And so freedom has a value as the enabler of all human like projects or whatever.
So animal, is that transcendental or not?
It's transcendental in the sense that it provides the conditions of the possibility, but it provides an immanent source in like the ground of human existence, not in a source exterior to human being.
Is the transcendental ego exterior? I didn't notice that.
Oh no, the Sartre rejects the transcendental ego.
Oh, okay.
The ego is unified in action. There's no unifying. I'm sorry. So in the transcendence of the ego, Sartre says that the concept of sorry.
That's funny. I'll call the book Transcendence of the Ego. They'll say transcendental. There is no ego.
Yeah, he calls it the transcendence of the ego because he's addressing the issue in Husserl. So that's the reason it's called that. And so he ultimately the transcendental ego as an object does not exist. Rather, the ego, the unified ego, makes its appearance in the unity of the present state, its actions, and the qualities of things. And because those things appear as unified, philosophers have made an erroneous argument from their apparent unity to the existence of a being that is a transcendent, that grants that unity. But Sartre is saying, no, you just feel as though there must be some entity because you're experiencing the unity of those. Yeah. But your experience just is the experience of that unity. There's no being behind that unity that's granting the unity that is your ego.
But that's my usual object, is that experienced unity.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
because
but they're not unified.
But they're unified by. But they're unified by these temporal processes, not by some being that is the transcendent ego. You want to reveal the man behind the curtain, but Sartre is saying there is no man behind the curtain. The man is the operating of the whole apparatus, which gives the appearance of a unity. But there's no ego that's granting the unity behind that. It's the totality of the manifold that's being given.
So it's a fundamental mistake to name it as object.
To take it as a being. It's not a being or a thing like that. Not even you. It's a merely theoretical postulate. Yeah.
I feel like you took my chocolate away from me.
Yeah. Maybe that this, though, I wonder, there might be a big tension in that Sartre is a really strident atheist, and that the loss of this sort of like sort of thing is not troubling to him at all. Like, yeah, okay.
A transcendental chocolate.
You join us for the full Husserl seminar, and we'll have a whole box of chocolate for you.
Thank you.
I do think basically, in a way, Sartre is the kind of monist. There is being before the arrival of the for itself. It's who knows what it is, some undifferentiated. The for itself arises through the process of negation, and now we have something that can differentiate and particularize, and that's the thing to which truth in the world and history appears, and so on and so forth. But it is really just a modality of being, right? And the for itself also appears as in itself, my body, things that happen to me. I can take myself as an object and see the hand there. That, you know, this is what Beauvoir calls the ambiguity of our existence, as we oscillate between existing as in itself and for itself.
One more thing I meant to ask when you're doing the Heidegger part of the fourfolding, there's a pretty outstanding analogy between Heidegger's painting that picture of the clearing and explaining, walking through being that way, and what he views as being, and the cave in Plato, right? It's sort of that's been compared, right? So they're pretty obvious comparisons.
Heidegger himself takes up that image and the idea in a couple of kind of important middle, as like the essence of truth, and Plato's concept of truth are two good sort of places for that. Heidegger thinks Plato's where it all goes wrong. And ontotheology begins.
Socrates shows up to the tragic event. Ask questions.
Well, I'm being a little bit flippant. It all goes wrong, but a lot of things go right too. I mean, certainly, Heidegger makes this really interesting point. I've always liked how a good one of the things that I think, again, I sort of have to feel like I have to defend even reading or talking about Heidegger because he's such a dirtbag, but he has this bit in, he makes a big deal out of turning and the turn and getting the thing, and he has this really kind of cool interpretive moment where he talks about in the cave when the prisoner is freed, they have to turn around. And it's the turning gives them the new perspective and brings into view this new thing, and the shadows on the wall withdraw as they turn, and the new their new knowledge and the new things they see come forth and are revealed as they turn into it to face it, and so on. And it's like, well, yeah, right. It's like seems very cool, and it's an exciting reading of the cave allegory and things like that. It makes it kind of new and interesting, something that a lot of philosophy students have read 100 times or whatever. And those little things I find it's kind of worth returning to, though. I generally try not to recommend Heidegger to people anymore. So, mostly because of the whole Nazi thing.
What are you gonna do? Well, I there, he does bring a lot to the table, and you make your decisions about what to recommend.
I spent a lot of time reading books, and I guess I should make some good of it.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions about Sartre, Beauvoir, Heidegger, even, we can move on to our finale. Fanon finale. Nothing's on the Facebook. Someone asked if we sell bagpipes. So clearly they don't have anything to say. So we'll pass it on. Angela Heredia. Some Fanon.
Okay, there is a storm. I don't know if my internet will die, but I hope it doesn't. So I'm gonna put a presentation where I put a few quotes, so it's easier. Could you enable it, Kelly?
Did it? I should have. Did it work? Are you good now? No.
Wait. Now it's good.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Can you see it? Okay. So I titled the presentation "Fanon and Non-Being," and I'll try to explain why the title during the presentation. Okay. So Fanon is usually known as a philosopher and phenomenologist of race and colonialism. But beyond this, I think his work presents us with an anti-colonial critique of the foundations of these disciplines. And one of the key points of critique is the question of ontology. So one of the key areas of Western philosophy has been ontology, or as we have been talking about, an inquiry that addresses in a sort of neutral and objective way the question of being, right? What does being in general can mean? Or what does being for human existence in general mean, right? So for Fanon, such inquiry is insufficient to address the being of blackness and what it means to be or to not be in a world that is pierced by coloniality and racialization. So it is not only that the reflections of being displayed in the history of philosophy do not apply to the reality of blackness and the colonial world, but rather that they take as a point of departure a neutrality and objectivity that sort of needs but tends to hide its own partiality and historicity. So Fanon says in Black Skin, White Masks, sorry, he says, every ontology is made unattainable in a colonized and civilized society. It would seem that this fact has not been given sufficient attention by those who have discussed the question. In the lived world of a colonized people, there is an impurity, a flaw that allows any ontological explanation. Someone may object that this is the case with every individual, but such an objection merely conceals a basic problem. Ontology, once it is finally admitted as living existence by the wayside, does not permit us to understand the being of the black man. For not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to the white man. Some critics will take it on themselves to remind us that this proposition has a converse. I say that this is false. The black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. So throughout the presentation, I'm gonna try to unfold a little bit what all this means. But basically, what Fanon is saying here is that the reflections on being in the history of philosophy are reflections that depend on the assertion of the non-being or a kind of ontological uncanniness and instability of certain corporalities. So in other words, coloniality and its violence inhabit the core of the question of being and how this question has been addressed by philosophy. So coloniality, or the mode of power relations that emerges with Western colonialism and imperialism, and that is iterated even after political decolonization. Coloniality, this form of relations of power, aims to be an ontological force for Fanon. What does this mean? That it aims towards the materialization of a specific order of being, or for him would be an order of not being. So there is this constant effort to materialize this specific order of being that is masked as a neutral account of being. In other words, there is an attempt to give an intrinsic legitimacy to this order by collapsing the level of description, the question of what is to be, with a prescriptive level that is what ought to be. So for Fanon, and I am taking here a little bit of Sylvia Winter's reading of Fanon, the colonizer, which is man, the bourgeois, white, able-bodied, heterosexual man, that figure that becomes for Sylvia Winter the figure of the human, what for us means being human in a colonial world. The colonizer of man sort of over-represents itself as the force that sustains and moves everything that exists. Sustains and moves being in general. So in this sense, the historicity of this order fails to be present, and this historicity for Fanon sort of spectrally inhabits this order as its condition of possibility. So even if it's the condition of possibility for man to assert both its humanity and its being, it's sort of hidden or not, it does not appear precisely. It fails to appear within this order as a condition of possibility. So in this sense, the colonial order claims ownership towards the past, the present, and the future by seeking to overcome and over-representing itself as absolute being, as the only mode of being human possible. So it presents this order of being as the only way in which the human itself can realize itself as human. So it pretends to be the force that will bring the world towards a just version of the human, when, for Fanon, it paradoxically ends up harming a human mode of being. And the result of all this is that the colonized humanity is always measured against man's overrepresentation of the human and of being. For Fanon, this hinders the possibility of humanity itself. So what it's understood as the human and being in the colonial order is, for Fanon, an inhuman mode of being, precisely because it's inhabited by inhuman violence everywhere. So what Fanon is trying to affirm here is he's presenting us a radical affirmation of the historicity of the notion of being. So the notion being and its boundaries, and here by being I mean something very material, not just a conception of being, by an order of things, a material order of things. So being and its boundaries have been sociogenically materialized. They have not been given, but by materialized and crystallized by history, power relations, and modes of exploitation. And this is something that he develops a little bit more in the Wretched of the Earth than in Black Skin, White Masks. Okay. Okay. So the second thing I want to talk about is how all this emerges from sort of radicalizing what for me is a phenomenological mode of understanding being, and it's taking seriously the body as the source of meaning and the source of being. So Fanon is very clear in saying from the beginning of Black Skin, White Masks that he does not want to be objective, and that objectiveness is impossible. And it's precisely this what for him makes ontology both harmful and impossible within a colonized world. So he says in Black Skin, White Masks, in this work, I have made it a point to convey the misery of the Black man, physically and affectively. I have not wished to be objective. Besides, that would be dishonest. It is not possible for me to be objective. So what Fanon is trying to say here is that the primacy of ontology is sort of like this putting the question of being in a neutral way as the primordial mode of inquiry, sort of it's done at the expense of the ethical and political questions. So for Fanon, it is not only that ontology hinders ethics and politics and put it in a second plane, but that a specific situation or a specific mode of existence is presented as the neutral and given mode of being, and masks its presentation as the only just and legitimate. So for me, what Fanon is proposing is to take seriously and radically an existential and phenomenological notion of being that affirms its irreducible historicity, situateness, and embodied character. So for Fanon, it is his body as a Black man, his own facticity, the source of his philosophical reflection, and his own facticity, of course, within this historicity of living in a world that has been colonized. So I always love this quote. This is the sentence that ends the Black Skin, White Masks. He says, "My final prayer, oh, my body makes me always a man who questions." So sorry, I got lost. So the body in its profound historicity, marked by the violence of coloniality, is the source of meaning, but also of non-meaning, and it is also the source of being and non-being for Fanon. Why? Because for Fanon, taking as a departure the experience of the racialized body, the body is a place of pain, a place of failure, of negativity, and it's not an organic connection between the subject, the object, and the world. So he's already putting forward a critique of the way in which embodiment has been accounted for in existential phenomenology, for example, in the work of Merleau-Ponty. So it is for this reason that Fanon is interested in addressing the question of non-being by working at the level of failure rather than normativity. He is interested in interrogating what he calls the engine of failure, this engine of negativity and pain that the colonial world is for him. That's why he is so interested in psychoanalysis, because for him, more than philosophy, psychoanalysis takes as a point of departure the failure and the pain of that failure of the normative. Okay, so, and you can see this clearly in his phenomenological exploration of racialization. For example, there is this sentence that is very charged and very powerful. He says, "What else could it be for me but an amputation, an excision, a hemorrhage that spattered my whole body with black blood?" So what Fanon is presenting us is a phenomenology of the Black body, but it is a body that is not fully human within a colonial order, precisely because it has been crippled by an anti-Black social environment. And by here, crippled, I mean a very material way of being wounded, of being in constant pain, of not being healthy, of being subjected to constant violence, etc. Okay. So to finish, I want to talk about a little bit what he means by the zone of non-being. So for Fanon, the colonial order divides the world and existence in two. He calls this in the Wretched of the Earth a Manichaean kind of division that sort of divides humanity between those that are fully human and those that are not. And for him, this means that this corporealities that are placed outside the space of the human inhabit what he calls the zone of non-being. So the colonial order projects its own failure onto corporealities that are considered to inhabit this inhumanity or this zone of non-being. They become problematic, locked in this uncanny ontological status that leaves them outside any subjectivity or outside even any subject-object relation. And within the colonial order, these corporealities, Fanon says, become the embodiment of evil and negativity. But as I had already suggested, the zone of non-being and the corporalities that inhabit it are actually the condition of possibility that sustains man's being and humanity. So it is only by the violent production of this zone of non-being that this colonial notion of the human or man's over-representation of humanity, as Sylvia Wynter says, can be possible. And this possibility for Fanon and as for Sylvia Wynter is very material. It's not just a conception of what it means to be human, but it means the materiality of creating, for example, spaces and environments that can produce or sustain, for example, healthy human bodies, while other environments, by being, for example, contaminated by toxicity, by long history of environmental extractivism, for example, become places that are unable to sustain healthy or are unable to sustain the life of these corporalities. So Fanon is talking here about a very material way of producing and materializing a world. So he says in white skin, why do I always change it? Black skin, white masks, that he says, sealed into that crushing objecthood, I turned beseechingly to others. Their attention was liberation, running over my body, suddenly abraded into non-being, endowing me once more with an agility that I had thought lost, and by taking me out of the world, restoring me to it. But just as I reached the other side, I stumbled, and the movements, the attitudes, the glances of the other fixed me there, in the sense in which a chemical solution is fixed by a dye. I was indignant. I demanded an explanation. Nothing happened. I burst apart. Now the fragments have been put together again by another self. So the zone of non-being is for Fanon this hell of the lived experience of Blackness confronted with an anti-Black world in which one's own humanity is always put into question. So what he's trying to address throughout this book is, what does the desire for humanity of the Black, of being Black, means in a world that is structured and materialized in a way that denies their humanity. So it implies this continuous pain and violence of always measuring one's own humanity against this colonial notion of the human that has overrepresented man's existence as if it were being itself or being human itself. Yes. What else? And this point is related to what he calls throughout Black skin, white masks, the corporeal malediction. And through this notion, he's signaling the opacity of the colonized experience as a body lived mainly as a body for others, which sort of contrasts with the familiarity, fluidity, and reversibility of the human experience of the colonizer. So is this a painful experience of always being split between the gaze of the colonizer and the experience of the colonized of feeling the inadequacy of oneself with that measurement of what the human is? So is this continuous experience of being split? That's why he says, I'm spattered, I'm fragmented after this. However, he always says, he says in a few parts of both The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks, that descending into the zone of non-being produces a certain kind of affirmation or revolutionary power, precisely because this anti-Black world cannot bear cannot bear even that someone that experienced racialization can ask this question itself, and through asking this question, affirming Black life itself. So that's why he says in Black Skin, White Masks, this is the first time that he introduces this notion. Actually, he says, there is a zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an utterly naked declivity where an authentic upheaval can be born. So, so actually the zone of non-being for him has the possibility to rethink what humanity and being can be. So he sees it as a place in which, while of course without romanticizing all this violence and all the pain that happens in there, he says that inhabiting this place and asking this question actually can allow us to see that what we think is human within this colonial world is actually not, and that we actually need to, he says in The Wretched of the Earth, reinvent humanity from the ground. And yeah, that's it. That's what I had to say today. Thank you. Wait, let me. Right.
I just have a speculative question. You know, you wonder, what do you do in that situation here where the colonialized theoretical justification system does literal and metaphorical violence to your person, to your material body, and you need to fight for yourself and fight for your corporeal body. How do you fight the machine in order to get them to stop and to build with you from the ground up, to let go of those preconceived notions and to get them on board with fresh new sight of what it means to be human? How do you get them to listen?
Yes. Yes, the answer is not hopeful for Fanon. And the answer to this is his reflections about violence. So he always says that decolonization is a violent process because it implies building from the ground humanity itself and sort of violating the space that has been created within the colonial world as the human, and violating that space in any way just by your mere appearance within that space as a Black man or woman, for example, is seen as violent. So your mere appearance within that space of the human is violent. So for Fanon, yeah, of course, it's an unavoidable violent process. That for him, it was a tragedy. In his reading of the process of decolonization in Africa, he read it as a tragedy. He participated in that, of course. But yeah, I guess that the concrete answer would be collective political action is the only way. But with the warning that that's never, you cannot romanticize that as an easy process, I guess. Yeah, so he's very grounded in that sense. I find him very illuminating in that part.
So with great pains and careful
Yes.
force, we can try. Okay.
Angela, so being the apologist or Hegelian here, whichever you want to call them, or both, you know. So I sew this into the fabric of the master-slave in the Hegelian development of consciousness, which is saying that, you know, we think of the master as dominating, but it's the consciousness that comes out of the slave, the oppressed, who really obtains the truth of that relationship, and an ontology has to encompass that point of view to subsume that situation. So you know, to me, this has been a lesson about, yes, you must always study that position. You must really learn about that. You have to speak to who is in that position and find out what is that, because that's the humanity that is really the basis of progress at this moment. Anyone who's oppressed is more aware of the culture and the society, because their suffering was being ignored in consciousness, right? And their consciousness is double and developed. Double, like it says here, the Black person knows what the white person doesn't know, which is the Black in terms of white. So, and that's universal. So this seems a little connected to that Hegelian message, right? I mean, I know he's like some white guy,
Yeah.
but you know, I think there's a little insight there, right? It's kind of related, right?
Yeah, he has a whole critique about the dialectics. If I remember well, one of the points is that I mean, I haven't read Hegel in a long time, but I remember Fanon says that one of the sort of wrong point of departure of Hegel first is that there can be sort of any reciprocal kind of relation there that is not. And second, I think he says that what the slave is looking is not any notion of truth, but material subsistence. And that's what I remember he says, but I might be wrong. But my point is that he has a whole critique of that. Yeah. And I guess he would say also that the press does not need to be spoken for, you know, like.
I couldn't hear that.
There is no need. Yeah, there is no need for the intellectual to speak for the oppressed. So there is no, like the oppressed already can interpret its reality and takes action. Yeah, I think he would say that, like, there is no need of that, I guess.
Oh,
I think that this is one of the question that Animal asked is almost like at tension with the Fanon's thought, like in a way. And I think that that's what is fueling Fanon's critique of Hegel, because in Hegel there is often this kind of like there's a recognition, and then there's this kind of reciprocal movement that happens, and I think that Fanon, for the oppressed, it would be nice if the oppressed could make their call and it would be recognized, and then everybody would get like their house in order, and we would like have this like reconciliation. But the demand of the oppressed and the injustice that's been done to them is one that like outstrips those notions of like reconciliation. So that if the oppressed makes the demand and the people who are oppressing them aren't like, oh, okay, so let's change things, then the oppressed can like force change, because the outrage against them is such that if the oppressors can't, and plus the oppressors are de-incentivized against against recognition. So in order to recognize the position of the oppressed, the oppressor has to recognize that they need to give things up, and wealth needs to be redistributed. And so there's an extreme disincentive against them joining in the kumbaya circle. So with those two like factors at play, I mean, Fanon is not, he supports revolutionary violence.
Right.
Again,
I think, yeah, I would go on, please.
Yeah, so what I didn't talk about this, but his claim mainly is that the space of the ethical, the space of the self-other relation within the colonial order has been captured, and has been captured that the space of justice within there has been colonized, and therefore any demand from the colonized, from who lies outside that space, is gonna be received as violent. That's what I was talking about. The mere appearance of a Black person within that space saying whatever demand is gonna be received as violent, and is gonna be responded with violence. So that's why for him, of course, decolonization is unavoidably violent.
Yeah, I would actually, once again, this is my eccentric reading of Hegel, probably, that this is exactly the way I read Hegel, what you're saying, which is the master will never transcend their position. That is the ontologically inferior position. Only the bondsman, only the subservient, only the one who's been forced down is looking at the other person as a person, because they are being dominated by a person. They understand what the freedom is. The person who's dominating is looking at the person they're over, not as a full person, like as an animal, as a beast of burden, as someone who does things that they're told. And the person who's suppressed knows what freedom is, and they're forced to act without their freedom, and they understand freedom. They're the only ones that can repair what is missing. So they have to overcome that situation, whether it's with violence or not. They're the only ones with the consciousness to proceed to a higher level. The other person doesn't even recognize humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think there's a
what is
harmony.
I don't remember how is the outcome of that. I forgot. What is the outcome of the struggle?
The only outcome is a complete subsumption of those 2 points of view, and I assume that means an overthrow.
Mm-hmm.
Because you always eat your enemy. You eat your opposition. You subsume. It's not pretty.
Also, Fanon is also interested in the. I think that this is related to the central question, which is that Fanon also seems interested in the kind of Marxist trend of the one of the interesting things about the oppressed class, philosophically interesting, is that they want to destroy them, they want to annihilate themselves as a class. So there's a sense in which there's a tension within Blackness for Fanon that on the one hand, it seeks its own value, like in the Negritude movement and that kind of thing, to try to reinvent and find value in Blackness and assert its value. But on the other hand, because it's oppressed under the name of Blackness, it's also seeking to annihilate, to destroy Blackness as the order of its oppression. So Fanon is attempting to navigate some of that as well, which is related to the slave status and to the status of oppressed and the role and the dialectic that it plays with the, you know, Marx is also Hegelian of a sort and all that kind of thing. I don't know that I'm well versed enough to like articulate exactly how that plays out in Fanon's thinking, but it's one that I read with interest when I read Fanon.
I think for that question is very interesting, the wretched of the earth. Because when he talks about violence, he does not just talk about the violence from the colonizer to the colonized, but the violence within the colonized space itself. So I mean that within the colonial order, this impulse of self-annihilation, it's also imposed, or how do you say it, materialized in the colonized. So that's why he says there is so much violence within the colonized people themselves, right? So he's saying not only that there is a violence from the white to the colonized, to the black or the brown, but that the colonial order creates a world in which even between brown and black people, we sort of annihilate each other's humanity. So it's not just this way, but also horizontally. So that's very interesting too.
But it can't end in some sense because people are always going to be in some opposition. Is that sort of the downside here?
I think the big political question becomes how could we organize society such that those tensions could be more productive rather than harmful.
Annihilate materiality.
Yeah, I don't think there is an answer in which I think that Fanon definitely is like an existentialist when it comes to this kind of question. I think you can clearly see Beauvoir and Sartre and Fanon as sort of fellow travelers, that they're very sort of pragmatic when it comes to these kind of political questions. And I don't know if they ever buy into any kind of like ideal, like, oh, if we just implement this political program, then we're going to ultimately work towards some sort of ideal society. I feel like they sort of thought that, well, humans just the way we are together, we find ourselves inevitably in these sort of oppositional positions sometimes. It's just our freedoms strive for all these different things, and there's things come in conflict. And our best like political hope should really depend on trying to like coordinate them so that they can be as helpful as possible without ever losing sight of the fact that we're going to have conflict and probably violence and things. I mean, I don't know that they think we can get out of it. You're scrunching your face. Do you think I'm misreading them as being too pessimistic?
Who, me? My
No,
facial scrunches.
Yeah, I just think that the question, if you take the colonial perspective like that of Fanon, the question can never be as as humans, because from the colonized position, that question has been already charged. So the question, again, I guess, it cannot be framed in this ontological way about what being human is, but a sort of more practical and situational political and ethical reflection that in this case questions the colonial world in that specificity, So I think that's what Fanon it's aiming towards by taking that situation very seriously and taking historicity very seriously and avoiding taking that ontological question of us humans as a point of departure, because he knows, he has experienced that that question is already politically charged. Why is it that we cannot imagine other modes of being human? He would say, I guess. Right? So the question is that, what do we think being human is, and isn't it that already something that has been colonized? Yeah.
So a pragmatic approach might be shining a light on just what those tensions are, and then maybe building from there a space that doesn't annihilate the tensions, because that would be futile. But maybe capitalize on them might be a bad term to use, but just make life slightly more efficient. Maybe some critical race theory might be helpful. I don't know. Let's not be controversial here.
Well, it might be controversial to have any hope in light of what was just said, but I think we ought to be that controversial. It sort of suggests there's no reconciliation, don't even consider this question. Maybe it's not an ontological question, it's a material question, okay? It's not something you answer in a room with a bunch of other people sitting there. Oh, yeah, I understand. It's a material question.
Yeah. Well, no more questions have been asked on our Facebook feed. Just an inquiry about bagpipes. So, are there any more questions, comments, revelations, or anything else that might become of this presentation?
I'd be curious if there's any feedback for, we've been talking about covering other thinkers. If there are people, what would people be interested in? So put that out there and hear some, for some feedback.
It's a good question. I mean, after Kelly, you're on mute, but after a full lunch like this, I can't imagine what it'd be like to be hungry. So good luck.
We're going to force feed you. I lived with an Italian guy for about a year and a half. He was always so offended when I'm full. No, you're not. No, you're not.
Eat.
You're eating more. So we're gonna. He told me after I had long hots and something else. I forget what it was. I was inducted. I am officially Italian now. So I'm gonna feed it to you. I'm gonna serve it up fresh, and if there is anything left on your plate, I will guilt you about there are people starving for philosophy out there who haven't found us yet. Okay. Enough of that. We could do being point 2 and go in the similar direction, but with different figures, or we could talk about different themes that we'd like to see out of the continental tradition. Explain. Any thoughts on that?
If we did being again, I could talk about Deleuze
Okay.
and the plane of eminence. Bodies without organs.
Yeah. The virtual. Um,
Some people may not know this. I wrote my dissertation under Dan Smith. So the Deleuze guy, as it were.
Being 2.0. Dylan.
Someone should do Badiou also. He wrote a big being book, Being an Event. If someone can do Badiou.
And event.
Being is set theory. That's Badiou in a nutshell. Being an event.
I don't think the analytics on board with that one. We talked about. Oh,
sorry. No, Badiou. Being is set theory, and also I'm a Maoist. I don't know.
Gadamer came up earlier.
Yeah, Gadamer.
Someone. And maybe Merleau-Ponty would it's a good solid 4, maybe. I don't know. Does he fit in well with the progression we've set so far?
Everyone I named was like the next generation of people. Except, well, Gadamer was older, but he didn't write Truth and Method until he was 60.
Mm-hmm. That's a good list to start. We don't have to make decisions right.
No, I'd be curious to hear what people wanted, and then tailor it to what feedback we got.
Oh yes. Unfortunately, the Facebook has no feedback right now. Just bagpipes.
Well, we can collect some in the meantime.
Hey, let's send out a Google form. You know, I've been having a lot of fun with the Google Forms. I'll send that out with the next email update with this list, and then what else would you like to see, and then we can go from there.
Yeah.
And then I could take myself out of the next one, which will be great because fall 2021 is going to be a cluster. So, cool. Yeah, I like that. All right. Wow. Anything else?
This was delightful, as always.
Yeah, so nice. My dog was very happy listening to us when he was sleeping.
Oh, okay. So we can't get a dog shot right now? We don't get to see?
Wait, should we?
We got to keep this rolling. Got to see the dog.
Well, this was really great.
Say hi.
Oh, hi.
Say hi. Yes, he was very happy listening to you.
Oh, see, and we'll ask him about his being there. We'll do a truly full scope.
Is the dog docile?
Yeah. No. Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Donovan and Engel, and thank you, David, for hopping on and this.
Oh, this was so amazing. I mean, it's like going into like some grad seminar or something. It's fantastic. Thank you all so much for your work and presenting everything.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you. See you soon.
Bye.